We've sort of taken you on a busman's holiday, haven't we? Because Newt's job, like yours, has to do with people. And jobs like people are never perfect, even as you and I. So if we deal with them kindly and considerately, we're adding something good to their lives. And incidentally, to our own. There's a wonderful quotation, I think, by John Donne. Let me read it to you. No man is an island entire of itself. Each man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. So, from one little cog in the wheel to another, good night. See you next week. I hope I've answered your letter in a helpful way, Thelma. A mistake, after all, is only human. The important thing is to learn from our mistakes and don't keep on repeating them. Now, I don't think I'd worry too much about telling your friend the truth. A wise man once said to me, mistakes are like knives. They can either cut you or serve you, depending on how you pick them up. Good night. See you next week. I've often wondered, too, why women do things like that. I got my first jolt when I was about 15. I was crazy about a boy who lived down the street from us, and at the time, I was proudly wearing his class ring. Well, one evening while we were sitting on my front porch, to stir up a little excitement, I guess, I decided to tell him that I didn't want to wear his ring anymore. And then he'd plead with me, and finally, after many sweet words of persuasion from him, I'd agree to make him happy again by continuing to wear his ring. So, full of confidence, I said, Arthur, I don't want to wear your ring anymore. And while I waited for the pleading to begin, he was taking a long look at me. And finally he said, all right. And he took the ring and he walked off the front porch, and I've never seen him since. I've never forgotten that young boy, because I learned a very important lesson through him. Don't drum up dramatic situations for yourself. Life is full enough of real ones with which you'll have to cope. Save your strength for them. At least I think that's what I learned. Perhaps the real answer to this should come from a man. Now, how about Socrates? After all, he's been dead so many years, we couldn't possibly argue with him. And Socrates said, women. Good night. See you next week.
Now, here again is Miss Young.
Thank you. Superstition. Let me read you one definition of the word. Superstition is but the hunger of the soul for an active, knowing belief in God. Well, good night. See you next week. Perhaps all of us can profit, in one way or another, from these words of Mr. Longfellow. Ah, nothing is too late, till the tired heart shall cease to palpitate. Well, good night. See you next week. I heard it said once, to know the time is fine, to use it well is divine. Well, good night. See you next week. Oh, woman, woman, know thyself and thy frailties first. Then you begin to be a woman. Well, good night. See you next week. This is by Solomon. Therefore get wisdom, but with all thy getting, get understanding. Well, good night. See you next week.
Now, here again is Miss Young.
It's been said many times before, but it's always worth repeating. A sure way to failure is to compromise with principles. Well, good night. See you next week. We believe this is more than a truism. You as you are better by far than the you are trying to be. Well, good night. See you next week. This is a parent's prayer. Lord, that I may know myself, that I may see, that I may not misguide an innocent one. Well, good night. And we'll see you next week. Reform, like charity, must begin at home. Well, good night. And we'll see you next week. Happiness is a habit. Cultivate it. Well, good night. And we'll see you next week.
Now, here's Miss Young.
Thank you, John. There's an old English proverb which says, "The heart that gives gathers." Well, good night. And we'll see you next week. It is very often true that fear is the father of courage and the mother of safety. Well, good night. And we'll see you next week. To thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou canst not then be false to any man. Well, good night. And we'll see you next week. It is better to be small and shine than to be great and cast a shadow. Well, good night. And we'll see you next week.
Now, here's Miss Young.
Thank you, John. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. That's Shakespeare. Well, good night. And we'll see you next week. True love is like a river. The deeper it is, the less noise it makes. Well, good night and goodbye for a while.